Oh gosh, I'm in charge of the cold open.
No, you're not
Oh
in
no.
charge. You're not in charge.
Oh
No
no,
one's in.
no, no.
The key part of the
Okay.
cold open is nobody's in charge of the cold open. It's an anarchist aspect of our show.
Oh my gosh. I feel like I never say anything like you guys always have a good cold open that's like funny and light and
Don't
I just
don't tell us that because if we think everything we say is funny, like I don't know. I think sometimes the cold open's good, sometimes it is not funny. But first, let's just say it's time for Sound Politics. This is Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Sarah Mizes-Tan, KUOW's state government reporter, sitting in for Libby Denkman today.
Sarah, it is really great to have you back on Sound Politics.
I am happy to be here again.
Okay, Sarah, so the legislative session in Olympia is over. And listener, I have a question for you. Do you know where your legislator is now, your state senator, your state representative? Because turns out they may be herding bison, or at least that's what one Republican in Moses Lake does when he's not legislating. Others are lawyering, farming, practicing medicine. Why is that, Sarah?
Totally. Yes, your legislator could be out herding bison right now. That's because Washington has a part-time legislature. So lawmakers usually have regular jobs when session is out. The lawmaking job gig here in Washington state just doesn't pay enough for it to be a full-time job for folks. So we're going to talk about whether that's a good thing or bad thing. But first, while you might think all those lawmakers hightailed it out of Olympia because their job was done, in fact, there's a fair amount of unfinished business back at the Capitol. So we're going to pull out some of those loose ends on today's show.
Yeah, so legislative session over, but now, this year, lots of lawsuits are coming for a lot of the laws made during the session and just recently signed into law. Last week, we talked with Let's Go Washington's Brian Haywood about his referendum challenge to the high earners income tax, the millionaires tax that Democrats have branded it that way. But Sarah, there's another one that you were following.
Right. And we're taping this on Thursday morning. I'm actually going to a press conference about another lawsuit related to the income tax later today. This is a separate court challenge about whether an income tax is even legal in Washington.
Okay, so that's two challenges there. Plus, we've got other challenges to other laws, a legal challenge to the new law on sheriff oversight that we've also talked about on this show.
Yep. So we're going to look into what awaits some of the most controversial new laws as the legislators come home to their districts.
That's right. So we'll do that first, and then we'll talk about the part-time jobs because, Sarah, you and you told me we could get out of the thicket of the legislature and the millionaires tax and the state Supreme Court and all these lawsuits and stuff. You're going to help us touch grass?
I love all the puns foreshadowing what's to come. Yes, we are going out into the woods.
Don't encourage me. Okay, so maybe not grass, but we're going to touch trees, pine needles. Let's do it on Sound Politics after a quick break. We're back, and Sarah Mizes-Tan, let's just get a quick update on where the challenge to the high earners income tax is. Last week, we talked about it. We heard from Brian Haywood that he was planning a challenge to whether he could file a referendum to overturn it. There is a little update on that, yeah?
Yeah. So the state Supreme Court has agreed to hear the lawsuit. You know, there's a lot of legalese that's in there, but essentially they are going to return that decision pretty quickly. So we'll be keeping an eye out for a decision on if there will be a referendum repealing the millionaires tax that could go before voters this November.
And that is so important for all the reasons we talked about last week. I'm interested to see what happens there. You are about to go, as you just said, to an announcement about another lawsuit against the millionaires tax, but this one is led by the Citizen Action Defense Fund, which is a group that is at least partially funded by Brian Haywood's Project 42. This group has retained former Attorney General Rob McKenna, a heavy hitter. He's leading that case. Is this challenge different than Haywood's challenge? And if so, how?
This challenge is maybe seen as like the big big picture lawsuit challenge. So Haywood's challenge on the referendum hinges on the constitutionality of just one particular clause in the law that bars it from being brought to a referendum before voters. And if he succeeds, basically, he can put it as a referendum on the ballot and it'll go before voters.
That yes-no question we talked about last week, it's very key to his strategy. It makes it easier for him to repeal the law.
Exactly. The lawsuit today is just on the overall constitutionality of the millionaire's tax. We have talked so much on this show about an old case back in 1933, one that established Washington's tax system, so a pretty important one, which basically says income should be taxed as property, which is so unusual. Basically, this is what has kept Washington from having an income tax, because any tax on income would have to be the same across all income levels. So the plaintiffs say, by this definition, the current millionaire's tax is unconstitutional because it levies a tax only on incomes over $1 million. They would say that if you're going to do this, everyone has to be taxed 9.9%. Supporters of the tax say, however, that the ruling that set the Constitution's standard from 1933 is just not up to modern day standards, and that Washington is the only state in the country where income is considered property, which is kind of interesting. So
it is. I know. I'm going to be really interested to see how that one plays out. So excited to hear more. I do. Before we move on, I have a quick update for you on another challenge. You probably paid a little bit of attention to this. It's the oversight law for sheriffs that the Democrats passed. We talked about this on the pod a few episodes ago. It does a number of things, but the most controversial one is it allows a state board to remove elected sheriffs. If you want the details on it, go back to that episode. If you just scroll down the feed, February 26th is when we did that episode. So since then, the State Sheriff's Association sent a letter to Governor Ferguson to veto that piece of the legislation, right? He said he might revisit what happens after a sheriff is removed from office, but, not super clear what's going to happen with that. Now, 4 sheriffs from Eastern Washington are suing to stop the law. Their argument is that the state constitution doesn't give lawmakers the power to create this system to remove elected sheriffs. And they have asked a Pend Oreille County judge. I've never gotten to say Pend Oreille County. It's my favorite name for a county, Pend Oreille.
You did a great job.
Thank you. Anyway, so they've asked a judge in Pend Oreille County to issue a temporary injunction to block the law from going into place. While the litigation proceeds, the Washington State Sheriff's Association is supporting that lawsuit, and they might bring their own separate suit soon. Ooh. The organization said it would have supported a similar bill that would have triggered a recall vote. We talked about this again on the episode, and it does bring up for me this question I still have that we asked the sponsor, Senator Lovick. Why not just, instead of removing the elected person, just put them to a recall vote to the people, just trigger a recall vote? He said that recalls are expensive and time-consuming, but he also said this is so rare anyway. I don't, anyway, I don't
Interesting.
I don't get it.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, this was a fight that I mostly stayed out of this legislative session, but it was a big fight. It was so big. And I thought this was one of the very few bills that Governor Ferguson signed and actually kind of seemed to walk it back when he was signing it. I don't know if you remember from the press conference on this where he signed it and then was like, thanks so much, but, we're probably going to still have conversations about this.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting. So you're saying he signed obviously pretty much everything. He didn't veto massive clauses, but this was the only one where he was like, not sure about this one.
Yeah, I thought it just flagged in my mind where I was like, that is so interesting and just speaks to the amount of controversy around this bill when it was working its way through in Olympia. But he did sign all the bills in the end. There is one major unresolved matter that lawmakers will look at next year, and that is the state of the budget and the budget deficit. Lawmakers are looking at filling a roughly $850 million budget deficit next year. Even if the millionaire's tax survives its legal challenges this year, it's not going to generate that revenue for 3 years. So we're probably going to be looking at another year with cuts. They're going to need to find even more space in the current budget.
For
and
those
if
cuts,
the million,
that's crazy.
yeah, exactly, more cuts. We already had some pretty heavy cuts in early childhood education and childcare subsidies. And yeah, if the millionaire's tax is deemed unconstitutional, a lot of that budget writing may have to just go back to the drawing board to balance the next 4 years.
I don't even want to think about it. The lawmakers can think about it. They can have that to look forward to next year. Next year is going to be a long session, right? Of course, that's 105 days. This year, the session was only 60 days. What are lawmakers doing with the rest of their time? And this is what I really want to talk about today, because you had a great story, Sarah, about the secret lives of lawmakers or the lawmakers' lives after the session ends. You did some snooping about what legislators do when they're not legislating and why exactly so many of them have side hustles.
Yes. Turns out lawmakers are people just like us. Mostly. And because Washington has a part-time legislature, the majority of them do have day jobs in the other 9 months of the year that they're not legislating.
Okay.
So let me take you out with me on a little trip that I took recently. I was out in the woods. We're deep in a forest off the side of the road in Centralia, and we're surrounded by Douglas firs. It's beautiful. It actually reminded me of the movie Train Dreams a little bit.
Oh, yes. I love that movie.
Felt like
I can
was
see
in
it
a
right
scene.
now. Yeah.
Yes. It was raining a little bit. It was a little bit misty, a little bit chilly. And I'm out there actually with perhaps an unlikely person to be out there in the woods with, Republican Ed Orcutt. He's a forester when he isn't serving in the legislature as the representative for this district. And he's out here in a big, bright yellow rain suit. He's got an orange hard hat on. He's got his measuring tape for his trees and a waterproof notebook. And he just looks pretty different than he did just a few weeks ago in his suit and tie with his hair combed and everything like that.
I love it.
Yeah, I have to say, I have just a really different perspective on him now that I've been out on a hike with him. He's a really outdoorsy guy. He told me about how his dad was a logger and he used to fight fires before he got into foresting. And then he kind of fell into politics through a friend. It was kind of, I don't know, it was a lot of fun, honestly, just getting to know that side of him that I probably would not have known otherwise if we just chatted in his office in Olympia. Yeah. It's funny how the suit kind of like puts up that like barrier in some ways. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but...
Yeah, and yet the yellow rain suit is very welcoming and inviting, or at least it's more personal to him. He's out there measuring trees.
Yeah, it feels like he was in his element. Like, to me, he seems like a guy who probably is more comfortable in his foresting gear than he is in a suit. But, I don't want to speak for him, but that was my take.
I love it. So this might seem weird or abnormal. It's actually super normal in state legislatures, right? 40 out of 50 states, as far as I can tell, have lawmakers that are not paid full time. There have been proposals in the past to change this here. You wrote about this year's proposal, which saw the likes of a Seattle Democrat teaming up with the chair of the state's Republican Party.
Yeah. Yes. The unlikeliest of allies, Representative Jim Walsh, a Republican, and Representative Breonna Thomas, a Democrat. They actually co-sponsored this legislation that would have amended the Constitution so the legislature could have more flexibility in determining how long they meet. So right now, it's baked into Washington's Constitution that they have to go for 60 days on even-numbered years and 105 days on odd-numbered years. These kind of strange bedfellows,
the
Walsh
folks
and
who
Thomas.
Want to change that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of unusual to have bipartisan support there. They wore matching Argyle sweater vests to support the resolution, which I thought was a very nice bipartisan touch there to show unity.
Yeah, and they are like lefty left and righty right.
Totally. I know. I feel like we should like link to the press photo of them standing.
We'll put that in
together.
the show notes. We can absolutely put that in the show notes.
They look cute together, but it did not pass. If it had, It would not have made Washington's legislature full-time, but it would have been maybe a step in that direction, just basically allowing for more flexibility in the legislature determining how long they meet for.
Okay, so not everybody wears Argyle sweaters. There are lots of people who disagree with this idea. And in fact, the guy wearing, that yellow rain suit, right, Representative Orcutt, right, out in the forest there, he told you that he thinks lawmakers having a side job is actually a good thing for the state. So why did this legislation fail? What are the arguments in favor of the system we have now?
So Orcutt thinks that a part-time legislature where you can basically have those regular citizens holding the job rather than more career politicians is what Washington's Constitution writers had wanted. Some other folks say that the benefits of a part-time legislature is it costs less for taxpayers, for one. And because the job doesn't pay very much, there's going to be a lot of churn in who serves in the legislature. So people just doing the job for a few years, which in some people's opinions is a good thing, as it keeps the legislature from getting too set in its ways.
There are so many funky jobs when you look around the legislature. Obviously, there's a lot of lawyers, like we mentioned, but you almost went out with Moses Lake Republican and bison rancher Tom Dent, who's a total character, by the way. I am a little bummed we didn't get to hear him ranching his bison.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sad we couldn't go out with a bison rancher.
Side note about Tom Dent. Technically, men are supposed to wear ties on the floor of the House. He gets around that by wearing a bolo tie and a cowboy hat, of course. but one of the reasons I also think he's interesting is he's a callback to the history of the legislature. That is one reason the legislature is this way.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally. Yes. Yeah, exactly. The legislature schedule is actually geared towards Washington having been an agriculture-based economy. So It was designed so that legislators who mostly used to be farmers or ranchers could go back in time to harvest their crops or tend to their animals in time for spring.
Yeah, spring planting season or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. That makes sense. That's why Tom Dent is like a blast from the past in that way. There are 2 or 3 farmers left in the legislature. Is that right?
Yeah. I know we've got a wheat farmer and there's an orchardist. But yeah, there are not a whole lot of farmers anymore, mostly small business owners or lawyers.
Agriculture is still really big to Washington State's economy. It's still really important, but it is not. Most Washingtonians today are not farmers, and we are trying to fit enough lawmaking for a state of 8 million people into 2 or 3.5 months, depending on the year. One thing that stood out to me from your story, Sarah, is that last session was described as brutal. This session was described as brutal. You see in the House, especially, just terrible impacts of, people stayed up all night debating the millionaire's tax. We've had legislators on in the morning who were up until, legislators on at 8 or 9 a.m. who were up until 4 a.m. the previous night or even later sometimes. You just see folks driven to seriously stressful levels to deal with it all in that short period of time.
Yeah. It's, objectively, especially the 60-day sessions, I've heard described as a sprint, and it really is just an all-out sprint. Andrew Villeneuve, whose organization helped propose that amendment that we talked about earlier.
The Argyle sweater matching one.
Argyle sweaters. He said that the number of brutal sessions means that the way the state is governed is just becoming more complex. So proposed legislation is just becoming more complex, and there are more policy issues that they're trying to address. In his mind, this signals the need for a legislature that can handle this level of complexity. A longer session would theoretically allow lawmakers to better understand the legislation they were working on. It would allow staffers to better inform them. And for regular Washingtonians, it would give them more time to be able to participate in the legislative process. That's kind of an interesting side note, but it would be easier for just regular people to get a response from their legislators during session, since right now your legislators are basically running around frantically trying to get things done when they're in Olympia. Yeah. And it would give lawmakers more time to meet with constituents about particular issues and hear more from you all, regular Washingtonians.
I thought the other thing that really shocked me about your story was there are strong disagreements on this, even within the same caucus, even within the same wing of the party, right? Like that Seattle Democrat we mentioned who was wearing the Argyle, she is a progressive Democrat, I think I would say. You also spoke to another really progressive Democrat, socialist Representative Sean Scott, who has been in office for 2 years, and he basically said, if the schedule doesn't work for you, hit the road. Did that surprise you as much as it surprised me?
Yeah, definitely. So I will say that this was probably one of the most surprising opinions to come out of this conversation from both sides of the aisle. Sean Scott, who is relatively new in the legislature and who I'm told did struggle with exactly this question of kind of figuring out how to balance the financials of working a full-time job and also the financials of working this part-time legislature job.
Right.
He actually came out and he said he doesn't think that the people he represents want to hear lawmakers complain about how hard it is for them to do their jobs.
Wow.
And he says the answer is just to work harder and smarter. Yeah, which I thought was just an interesting take from someone who is younger and who has struggled with a lot of the points that were brought up earlier. And I do also want to quote one more Democrat, since this is not just a Democrat versus Republican issue. Bob Hasagawa, who has been a senator for quite some time, he said he feels like, especially in short sessions, he barely has time to learn about the legislation that he's passing. Okay, so on top of not having much time, he also thinks that this whole issue of a part-time legislature kind of squeezes a certain type of person into the legislature job. So basically, kind of what we were mentioning with Sean Scott, but basically you just have to be someone who's either independently wealthy, so the pay of the legislature just doesn't matter to you, or you have to work a job that's flexible enough to give you 3 months off during the year, which is kind of unusual. He himself, Bob Hasagawa, was a commercial trucker, as some folks may know, and he said that after his first year being elected into the legislature, he actually had to retire from trucking because his day job just wasn't the kind of job that would allow him to be off for 3 months at a time. I think a lot of us can relate to that. So just a couple interesting points here to consider.
I think that's really interesting here because we've been talking about the quirkiness and who's more, do we want to represent the character of the state? But if you really want to represent it, you need to have, people from all walks of life. And I wonder, do we actually know if full-time legislatures, are they better at that? Do they, have more representative members because they're full-time?
Yeah, great question. Great question. There's not a whole lot on there, out there on this particular topic because there are only 9 or 10 full-time legislatures in the country. But we did find one small study that was done on a handful of states comparing the part-time legislatures to some full-time ones from 2021.
Okay.
And actually, it didn't really show a whole lot of difference in the demographics, which I was surprised by. So things like the gender or the racial makeup of legislators who worked in a full-time versus part-time legislature, it actually wasn't that different overall. And lawmakers remained mostly white men, no matter if they were full-time or part-time. But there were a few things the study couldn't capture. So things like the economic background of lawmakers was something that just isn't quantifiable in these studies. So I do think it's up for debate if that diversity would increase or decrease if we went full-time. But certainly we would probably lose some of the quirkiness that you were mentioning that comes from, having a forester who also serves as a legislator, or a rancher or a farmer if Washington's legislature went full-time. But we'd also lose the quirkiness that comes from, say, a car dealership owner serving in the legislature and voting against a bill that would allow for more electric car companies to open their own dealerships, which is an actual thing that happened.
Yeah, we don't even really have much time to get into that whole question of okay, if you work a whole other job, who is it for and what are their interests in the legislature? Because, that kind of quirkiness is the chair of the state government committee is a state employee. She also works for ecology and sits on the environment committee. I'm not saying those folks are self-dealing, but that's actually pretty common in the legislature. So that is not something we have time to get into, but I do think that this is a really interesting question. I'm sure it's one that will keep coming up. We had the proposal you covered. Senator Hasagawa, who you talked about, he proposed something a year or two ago. And so it's. I don't think the question is going to die, especially as Washington State gets bigger and more complicated.
And less agricultural.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, Sarah, it was great to have you in the host chair with me on Sound Politics today. Are you gonna do it again, or did we scare you off?
No, I loved it. I just hope I didn't scare any listeners off.
We'll see. That's it for Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone. Our editor is Gabe Spitzer. Our producer is Hans Anderson.
And I'm Sarah Mizes-Tan. This show is only possible because of your support. Please consider a donation at KUOW.org/politics.
And thank you for all of you who did donate during our spring fund drive. I guess it's like 2 weeks out now, so I don't need to talk about it anymore. But we will see you all next week.